Tonight on Primetime, after hours of talks in Pakistan, the US and Iran have failed to reach a deal. President Donald Trump is now signaling escalation, ordering a naval blockade targeting Iranian ports through the Strait of Hormuz, with the nuclear issue still unresolved and tensions rising. Talks fail, pressure rises in Hormuz. Welcome to the program. I'm Andy Mioch. The United States is tightening pressure on Iran, with President Donald Trump announcing a naval blockade through the Strait of Hormuz after talks in Pakistan collapsed, raising fresh concerns over escalation in one of the world's most critical shipping routes.
US President Donald Trump said Sunday the US Navy would swiftly begin a blockade of ships entering or leaving the strategic Strait of Hormuz after US-Iran ceasefire talks in Pakistan ended without an agreement. In a post on Truth Social, Trump said negotiations had gone well and that most points were agreed, but confirmed the two sides failed to reach a deal on Iran's nuclear program. Speaking to reporters after disembarking Air Force One, Trump struck a confident tone, saying very good things were happening regarding the Strait of Hormuz, while also describing Iran as being in a weakened position.
I think Iran is in very bad shape. I think they're very desperate. We had a meeting that lasted 21 hours. We understand the situation better than anybody, and Iran's in very bad shape. And just so you understand, Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. Will not have. There is no way that they're going to get. They still want it, and they made that clear the other night. Iran will not have a nuclear weapon.
United States Central Command said the blockade would begin on Monday and apply to all Iranian ports, adding it would be enforced impartially against vessels of all nations. However, the command clarified that ships travelling between non-Iranian ports would still be allowed to pass through the strait, limiting the broader impact on global shipping routes. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said early Monday that US maximalism and shifting goalposts led to the collapse of what he described as a near-complete agreement during talks in Islamabad. The negotiations, held in Pakistan on Saturday, were the first direct talks between the United States and Iran in more than a decade, and the highest-level discussions since the Iranian Revolution.
The price of oil surged Sunday night into Monday morning across Asian markets after President Donald Trump said the U.S. would blockade the Strait of Hormuz after peace talks with Iran failed.
Oil prices rose sharply in early trading after the U.S. announced that it would blockade Iranian ports starting Monday, dealing a fresh blow to hopes of stability in global energy markets. Brent crude, the international benchmark, rose strongly in early trading, while US crude also gained sharply. Wholesale gas prices also spiked 6%, while heating oil, a proxy for jet fuel prices, jumped 10% in early trading. Stock futures declined sharply. Futures that indicate where the S&P 500 will trade fell 1%, Nasdaq 100 futures slid 1.3%, and Dow futures tumbled more than 500 points. Oil prices have been a roller coaster since US-Israeli strikes on Iran prompted Tehran to impose a de facto blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, a conduit for about 1/5 of global oil and natural gas supplies. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important waterways for global energy shipments, including crude oil and liquefied natural gas. Before the conflict, hundreds of ships passed through the strait each day, carrying energy to global markets. But since the war began on February 28th, that number has fallen sharply, with fewer than 10 vessels a day managing to pass through.
Let's now bring in Earl Carr, founder and CEO of CJPA Global Advisors, joining us from the Semaphore World Economy Summit, where global business and political leaders are gathering to assess the state of the world economy. Earl, welcome. Great to have you here with us. Now, you're over there among global policy makers and business leaders. How much is this situation in the Strait of Hormuz currently shaping all those conversations over there?
Well, first, it's great to be with you, and thank you so much for the invitation. At the annual Semaphore Economy meeting here in Washington, D.C., the Strait of Hormuz is front and center on most people's minds. There is one specific business session this afternoon that is dedicated towards infrastructure and global supply chains. So it is front and center of most conversations. I think the fundamental issue that everyone is talking about is how long will we see this conflict continue to go on, and when will fundamentally oil prices come down? When Trump was asked yesterday on Fox News whether oil prices would be high leading up to midterm elections, he gave kind of a wishy-washy answer, saying that the oil prices could be the same, they could be lower, or they could be a little higher, which essentially represents he doesn't exactly know. And so there's a lot of concern, particularly in Americans throughout the United States, but throughout the global economy is, what are the long-term implications of this that's front and center on many people's minds.
Well, Earl, we've seen markets react as they have throughout this conflict, but in simple terms, what do you think they're most worried about right now?
I think the average person in the United States is trying to understand the connection. Why did we have this war? This was a war of choice, not a war of necessity. And that is really important. And many people forget that. The United States and Israel did attacks on Iran. And if you look at historical presidents, if you look at President Obama, Anthony Blinken, former Secretary of State, gave an interview just recently. It said that, the Israelis put a lot of pressure on President Obama to, essentially do a strike on Iran, and they chose diplomacy instead. Former presidents George W. Bush, Clinton have also discussed that there was a lot of enormous pressure by the Israelis, but no previous president chose to attack Iran because they knew that there could be a potential blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. So I think that's really important. The other thing that I think is not getting enough attention is that there will be enormous pressure, not just in the developed world, United States, in Europe, but in the developing economies, because of fertilizer. Vast amounts of fertilizer are utilized in developing economies. They will be hurt disproportionately as opposed to other countries. But even in the developed economies, Ireland just recently announced that the government is going to cut fuel prices after protests. In Taiwan, there's talk about conserving on electricity because of the concerns of oil. So this is not just impacting developing economies, this is impacting developed economies. And right now, there's not a clear semblance of when this is going to end.
Exactly as you've said, it's not just oil, it's also fertilizer, helium, and many other things that rely on the Strait of Hormuz for passage. If things escalate there, what could that mean for the wider economy? What will be those practical impacts?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, you saw this morning, Monday, Brent crude oil was at over about $101. Brent crude futures is at 86, relatively high. But here's the staggering figure. 1 barrel of oil that is transferred from the Middle East to Asia is at $18 a barrel. That's almost 14 times higher than pre-war levels. So if you are, ordinary citizens, you're thinking to yourself, what could what could escalate, right? And I think what we're also seeing within the last few weeks, we've seen Pakistan launch strikes into Afghanistan. You've seen a more heightened posture in mainland China vis-a-vis Taiwan. You've seen Japan make more stringent talks about how they would protect Taiwan. I think globally there is a concern of how can this further escalate? What if Russia chooses to take other countries such as Estonia, given what's going on, this Machiavellian geopolitical environment and ecosystem has really provided more strife rather than peace in the region.
A lot of moving parts here, Earl, but let's go to the basics. Are these higher oil prices then impacting the fuel and everything else? Is this something people should expect to stick around, or is this likely to pass?
Great question. Most analysts believe we are not going to see immediate reductions in oil prices anytime soon. And I think that is something that Americans and people around the global economy need to understand. The damage that was inflicted on countries like Qatar are going to be, they said on average, will take about 3 to 5 years to rebuild the infrastructure in countries like Qatar. I mean, these are not things that you can just flip on a switch and then expect oil prices to come down tomorrow or next month or in a few weeks. Once again, I come back to this notion of this was a war of choice, not by necessity. And there were other diplomatic, routes that could have been pursued. Was the regime by and large, viewed as evil around the world? Absolutely. I mean, the slaughtering of thousands of people by their leaders is horrible. But I think what we have right now is Iran is utilizing leverage that it has on the Strait of Hormuz, and that is a choke point that I think the Trump administration did not adequately think through, and it's not something that they can just unilaterally change. Iran has a vote in the matter.
With this war and now that fragile ceasefire, all the lingering tensions, do you think global giants, major companies, are rethinking of their how to make their supply chains, or is it maybe too early for that?
I think right now there are a lot of discussions around potential alternatives to the Strait of Hormuz. There is the East-West pipeline. There are other like in pipelines in Turkey. They're also in Iraq. But here's the fundamental issue. They are a fraction of the 20 million barrels of oil that go through the Strait of Hormuz. So at this current moment in time, and as you said, when you factor in the amount of fertilizer, helium, and other products that are vital to the global economy, there are no real fundamental alternatives at this moment in time. So the Trump administration blockading and saying that, oh, we are now going to blockade Iran, whether they or Iran, the fundamental issue is that oil cannot get out of the Strait of Hormuz. That's the issue. Until we have a viable plan to get oil out of the Strait of Hormuz in an enduring manner, which must include peace, we're stuck in we're kind of stuck in a bind.
Earl, thank you so much for coming on the program and sharing your analysis and insight.
Thank you.
Now, after the break, we will be taking a look at a rare moment of cooperation between Russia and Ukraine, even as accusations fly over a fragile Easter ceasefire. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. Russia and Ukraine exchanged 175 prisoners of war each on Saturday in a rare moment of cooperation after more than 4 years of conflict, even as both sides went on to accuse one another of breaching a short Easter ceasefire within hours of it coming into force.
Russia and Ukraine exchanged 175 prisoners of war each on Saturday in their latest swap, one of the few areas where the two sides have continued to cooperate during more than 4 years of conflict. Russia's defense ministry said the exchange was mediated by the United Arab Emirates and that the released Russian servicemen were transferred to Belarus for medical and psychological treatment. President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine had also brought home 7 civilians and said most of the released servicemen had been held in Russian captivity since 2022. Returning Ukrainians were greeted by cheering relatives, many holding photos of loved ones still in captivity.
Overall, 182 people have been released. That is 175 military personnel and 7 civilians. And 163 of them had been held captive by Russia since 2022. So this is a real success. It is a very significant achievement. It is very hard to imagine what these people have been through during that time, and you can see that the men are returning in varying conditions.
The exchange came just before a 32-hour ceasefire announced by Moscow to mark Orthodox Easter, one of the most important religious holidays observed in both countries. The truce took effect at 1300 Greenwich Mean Time on Saturday, with Zelensky saying Ukraine would abide by it and urging that it continue beyond Easter. But within hours, both sides accused each other of violating the ceasefire. Russian officials said Ukrainian drone attacks in the Kursk and Belgorod border regions injured 5 people, while Ukraine's military said Russian forces had broken the truce 469 times through assaults, shelling, and drone strikes. The accusations echoed a similar Easter ceasefire last year, when both sides also blamed each other for violations.
Let's now bring in Ines Burrell, a UK-based analyst focusing on Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. Ines, very good to have you here with us. Let's start with this prisoner swap. Obviously, we've seen both sides cooperating here. How important would you say that is in the context of this conflict?
Well, prisoner swaps are very rare, and especially they are very difficult to achieve from the Russian side, because generally Russians tend to let go only some of a small contingent of what they have, including civilian hostages, whereas Ukrainians are working really hard to get their people back from Russian side. Don't forget that Ukraine is a society where human life is incredibly important. And I know it sounds a tad strange considering that there is war going on, but only in society where another person's life is valuable can you give up yours to protect it. Whereas Russians, from their side, have been willing to exchange high-value hostages and not hostages, high-value individuals, like, for example, Viktor Medvedchuk. He was exchanged for 200 Mariupol defenders in 2022. People from Chechnya usually go easily, but everybody else has to wait for many years in Ukrainian captivity because they're simply not wanted by Russians, whereas Ukrainians want their people back. There's a difference.
Well, as you've mentioned, these exchanges are a rare occurrence. At the same time of this last one, we also saw a ceasefire announced, which was then quickly challenged by both sides. What would you say does that tell us about trust between Moscow and Kiev right now?
Well, there is none. There hasn't been any trust for many years, and there won't be any for many generations, unfortunately. These ceasefires are generally not agreed on for the sake of ceasefire. They are agreed as a move on the chessboard, as a geopolitical strategy. For example, this one was initially suggested by President Zelensky. Putin ignored it for a while and then suddenly announced that it is in place without discussing it. In effect, we know that the Russian side doesn't really value human life, so it's a strategic way for them to show that they are interested in peace, in diplomacy, but in reality, I doubt very much that they actually are planning to hold any ceasefire that they will agree on.
Well, now that you mentioned this symbolism of these short ceasefires, do you believe that these short truces, these prisoner exchanges, actually create any space for diplomacy, or are they only symbolic at this stage?
Well, it's probably that diplomacy creates space for prisoner exchanges because otherwise they wouldn't happen. And essentially, diplomacy is put it this way. If it wasn't for diplomacy, these exchanges would be much rarer. They were really difficult to achieve. Ukraine has been fighting for each and every one of them. And thanks to these negotiations, even though they haven't brought any other results, these exchanges have become more common than they were before. At the same time, Ukraine diplomacy, when both sides have completely opposite goals, is kind of impossible because Russian side wants to subjugate Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't want to be subjugated by Russia. What can they talk about? There is no place for compromise there.
Well, as you've put it, both sides continue to accuse each other of various violations, but how difficult is it to establish what's happening on the ground?
Oh, it's very easy. Very. There are drones, there are videos. What are you going to do with this proof? There is no established if-then rule. If you violate, then something happens. There used to be international law. Now it's gone. It can be invoked in separate occasions, but you have to have parties who want to abide by it. Russia doesn't abide by international law. When it comes to international community, all they can offer here are considerable, are very severe words. And we haven't even heard those recently, even though Russia is intentionally targeting civilians in Ukraine for 4 years. So we can prove everything, and what is it going to do? It's not going to achieve anything.
Just a few minutes ago, you mentioned a chessboard. Now, looking at the bigger picture here and what's happening in the Middle East, do you see the war in Ukraine taking a backseat to what we're seeing now with the Strait of Hormuz, the tensions between the Americans and the Iranians? How is that impacting the general sentiment in Ukraine? How is that impacting chances for any peace talks, for any truce talks?
Well, Ukraine has to fight its fight. It can't afford to be sidetracked by what is going on somewhere else. They are trying to use the situation in the Strait of Hormuz to their own advantage and doing it rather well, because they have signed quite a few agreements on the defense contracts, and they have actually shown that they have serious influence in the world. As to the European side, well, they can't be sidetracked simply because something else is happening in the other side of the world, because it's like with pacifism. You can be a pacifist if the other side is pacifistic as well. But if the other side wants to fight, it's not your choice. So you can't just lay back and do nothing. Europe doesn't have a choice. They might not understand it yet, but it's not that Ukraine needs Europe. It's Europe who needs Ukraine.
Now that you mention Europe, we are seeing a major change within the European Union. Hungary is no longer going to be led by Viktor Orban, a man known for his vetoes on things benefiting Ukraine recently, including that vital 90 billion euro loan. Do you think this development might help Ukraine in the foreseeable future, and how?
Well, the money that was held up by Viktor Orban was very important for Ukraine. It constituted, as far as I know, 90 billion, which were intended for 2 years that they needed to pay towards army and other defense expenses. So without that money, it would have been very difficult to pay the bills and to continue fighting. They would have done it, nevertheless, but it would have been very difficult. Now that Orban is gone, Europe doesn't have to come up with an additional way to deal with Hungary. Of course, there is still Slovakia left, so we don't know whether they will put some spokes in the wheels of the 90 billion deal. But generally speaking, it is looking up much better, at least on financial front for Ukraine.
Do you expect Bratislava now to take over Budapest's role in blocking the loan and all other decisions, or do you think perhaps now with the change in Hungary, this might smooth things over with the EU?
Well, it's very difficult to say, but I would think that they probably are going to be less serious about fighting EU when they're on their own than when they were in a camp with somebody else. Besides, don't forget that power in Bratislava changed not that long ago. They're not naturally allied with Russia. It just so happens that they have a populist government who is opportunistic about earning money, really, because that's all it is about. They're striving to get as much Russian oil and other benefits for their own profits. So we don't know, but I would assume that it's not going to be as bad as it would have been had Orban won this time.
Ines, thank you kindly for joining us on Primetime.
Thank you.
Now, after the break, we'll take a look at the top business stories shaping the day with Katie Wilson. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. Now, let's cross to our very own Katie Wilson, who has the top business stories of the day. Katie, what have you got for us today?
Hi, Andy. Nice to see you here. Well, I've got the latest economic developments in terms of the war in the Middle East, as well as the latest from the car industry and the world of fashion. So, first this evening, oil prices have surged more than 7% after the United States moved towards a blockade on Iranian shipping, following the collapse of peace talks over the weekend. The escalation has rattled global markets, sending stocks lower and raising fresh concerns about inflation.
Oil prices surged more than 7% on Monday. It jumped after the US got ready to impose a blockade on Iranian shipping after peace talks collapsed over the weekend. The move could restrict Iran's oil exports and aims to put pressure on Tehran. It also leaves a fragile ceasefire in the balance. Brent crude futures were up at $102 a barrel by early European time. Oil has risen more than 40% since the war shut navigation of the Strait of Hormuz. The dollar also rose early Monday, while stocks and bonds fell. Both Asian and European bourses were down slightly. Europe's Stoxx 600 dropped just under 1% in early trade. Investors will now wait to see if the US begins more strikes on Iran. The Wall Street Journal reported Trump and his advisors were weighing limited strikes. Trump said on Sunday the price of oil and gasoline might stay high into November's midterm elections in the US. One leading analyst said there were growing worries about inflation, and that could get worse the longer the oil shock lasts. It's led markets to prepare for central banks to move towards raising rates. It's a sharp turn from pre-war bets on rate cuts or a prolonged pause.
Well, as the talks took place, Wall Street was following closely. US stocks closed mixed on Friday as investors tread cautiously. While tech shares pushed the Nasdaq higher, lingering uncertainty over a fragile ceasefire kept broader markets subdued, with fresh inflation data and falling consumer sentiment adding to investor nerves.
U.S. stocks closed mixed on Friday, with the Dow dropping more than 0.5%, the S&P 500 ticking down marginally, and the Nasdaq adding more than 0.33%, its 8th straight day of gains. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance departed for Islamabad for what Pakistan's Prime Minister called make-or-break ceasefire negotiations with Iran. The fragile 2-week truce has been threatened by claimed violations of the ceasefire, including Israel's continued bombardment of Lebanon. Anna Rothburn is founder and CEO of Granadilla Advisory.
As we've seen, the markets have been moving along with the headlines about the war. And certainly the ceasefire talks were welcome, and it seems to be holding, even though it's very wobbly, and they're going into the talks this weekend. Today, some of the volatility and uncertainty comes from leading into the talks. President Trump has said that the troops are ready to bomb Iran if it doesn't go well. And he sort of gave an indirect timeline of next 24 hours. So, of course, this type of rhetoric makes the market nervous.
Among the session's stock moves, tech shares led the gainers, with the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index touching a record high. Shares of Broadcom advanced more than 4.5%, while Nvidia added 2.5%. U.S.-listed shares of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, the world's largest contract chip maker, rose about 1.5% after it beat first-quarter revenue forecasts. And shares of cloud infrastructure firm CoreWeave surged nearly 11% following its announcement of a multi-year agreement with Anthropic. Also on Friday, the Labor Department's Consumer Price Index, the first major inflation indicator released since the onset of the war, showed consumer prices logged their largest monthly jump in nearly 4 years due to an expected spike in energy prices. And a report from the University of Michigan showed consumer sentiment plunged this month to a record low, with near-term expectations dropping to their lowest level since May of 1980.
Over in the UK, Britain's busiest airport is warning of an uncertain outlook as capacity constraints limit its ability to adapt to shifting global travel patterns caused by the Iran war. Despite rising passenger numbers, Heathrow Airport risks falling behind European rivals as key routes are reshaped by the crisis.
Heathrow Airport forecast an uncertain few months ahead. The West London hub said its growth lagged European competitors as runway slots remain full. The UK's biggest airport handled 6.6 million passengers in March. That was up nearly 7% from a year earlier, as it redirected traffic flows to cope with the airspace closures across the Middle East. The airport's CEO said it was doing everything it can to support airlines and passengers as travel trends shift during the Middle East crisis. The UK government approved plans for a third runway at the airport last year. But with the broader planning process expected to drag on for years, it's not expected to be operational until at least 2035. Heathrow warned in February that Istanbul will overtake it as Europe's busiest hub this year or next. The airport said Middle East routes plunged by over half, while Asia-Pacific and Africa traffic rose 31% and 23% respectively. British Airways, the UK's flag carrier and highest grossing airline, said last week it would cut flights to the Middle East when services resume, while adding capacity to India and Africa.
I know all too well the busyness of Istanbul Airport. To some other news now, and Volkswagen has reported a 4% drop in global deliveries as weakening demand in key markets like China and the United States takes its toll. The car maker is facing mounting pressure from fierce local competition and shifting economic conditions, despite signs of growth across Europe.
Volkswagen reported a 4% fall in global deliveries in the first 3 months of the year. The German auto giant was hit by weak demand in China and the US. VW said first quarter deliveries dropped 15% in China and by a fifth in the US. China has become a major challenge for German automakers like VW, Mercedes-Benz and BMW. They have to deal with an intense price war with fast-moving local brands like BYD. China's slowdown has also hit Volkswagen brands Porsche and Audi. Porsche's quarterly deliveries fell more than a fifth in the country. VW also saw pressure from tariffs and the end of electric vehicle subsidies in the US. The automaker said the first quarter saw, quote, very challenging economic and geopolitical conditions. Looking ahead, VW has bet on a wave of new EVs developed with local partners to regain ground in China. It also plans model launches for Europe, where the group saw growth in the first quarter. It said deliveries rose 4% in Western Europe and 8% in Central and Eastern Europe.
To the world of fashion now, and Dolce & Gabbana has confirmed that co-founder Stefano Gabbana has stepped down as chair whilst retaining his creative role. The leadership reshuffle comes as the luxury brand navigates challenging market conditions and explores potential strategic changes, including its ownership structure.
Dolce & Gabbana confirmed Friday its co-founder Stefano Gabbana stepped down from his role as chair. The Italian fashion house said he left the role from January 1st, confirming previous reports. However, the group said he will keep his creative role. A company filing showed Chief Executive Alfonso Dolce was appointed the new chair. He's the brother of co-founder Domenico Dolce. Bloomberg reported Gabbana was also looking at options for his roughly 40% stake in the company. That comes ahead of reported debt negotiations with banks. The luxury group also faces challenging market conditions. It has previously not ruled out the possibility of a minority investor or stock market listing. Domenico Dolce and Stefano Gabbana founded the company in 1985 and are still in charge of creative direction. Gabbana's resignation isn't the only reported change at the firm. Two sources have said former Gucci CEO Stefano Cantino is joining Dolce & Gabbana in an unspecified managerial role.
And finally, let's return to our top story, and we have a special report from 3 lower-income countries which are now facing renewed strain from the global economic shockwaves of the Iran war. Sri Lanka, Egypt and Pakistan are among those most exposed, as rising oil prices and currency pressure threatens to push already fragile economies back towards crisis levels.
Kelum Disanayaka, a 37-year-old Sri Lankan ride-hailing and delivery app driver, starts work at 4 a.m. But the country's spiralling costs and fuel rationing mean he's skipped his tuk-tuk's leasing payment 2 months running.
My
spouse is a housewife, and I have 3 school-going children, and now it's very difficult to live.
Along with countries like Egypt and Pakistan, Sri Lanka is in a group of import-reliant, lower-income countries. Analysts fear they face ripple effects from the US-Israeli war with Iran, which has caused oil prices to rise and hit trade. Despite this week's fragile ceasefire, Colombo has just reintroduced some fuel subsidies and negotiated a temporary easing of the terms of its International Monetary Fund bailout. Next week in Washington at the IMF and World Bank's spring meetings, there are likely to be other countries trying to do the same. The fund's chief said on Thursday it's ready to listen and expects to have to provide between $20 and $50 billion of emergency support. Former Pakistan Central Bank Governor Reza Bakir, who now advises governments in debt distress, says the conflict has hit vulnerable countries from almost every angle.
The call to action here, really, in my view, is for institutions like the International Monetary Fund to deploy their war chest of liquidity to provide financial support to countries like these that are the bystanders of this conflict and have a good track record of their macroeconomic policies.
The 40% surge in oil prices means import bills are soaring, just as remittance and tourism inflows come under pressure. As current account deficits widen, currencies come under strain. Egypt's pound has plunged over 10% since the war. Dollar-denominated oil and debt payments become even more costly. They then have to be covered by either FX reserves, more borrowing, or by cutting other imports. Pakistan's reserves stood at $16.4 billion on a gross basis at the end of last month. That's not enough to cover 3 months of basic imports. For Egypt, a hit to tourism is expected. The industry brought in $19 billion last year, and there's a potential impact on the Suez Canal too, plus an enormous debt burden that was already expected to absorb 60% of the government's revenues this year.
That's your business news for today. Andy, back to you.
Katie, an excellent selection for tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, after a short break, we will be taking a look at Hungary's political shift and what it could mean for Europe and Ukraine. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. Hungary's election result is already sending ripples far beyond its borders, with global leaders reacting swiftly to what many see as a turning point for the country's place in Europe and a potential reset in its relations with both Brussels and Moscow.
Global leaders have widely welcomed the election victory of Peter Magyar, describing it as a major political shift for Hungary and its relationship with the European Union. China's foreign ministry hailed Peter Magyar's election win and said it is ready to work with Hungary's new government to strengthen cooperation and bilateral ties. Across Europe, congratulations poured in shortly after the result, with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen saying Hungary has chosen Europe and describing the outcome as a return to the country's European path. French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and other EU leaders also welcomed the result, expressing hope for closer cooperation and a more united Europe. From the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Keir Starmer called the outcome an historic moment, not only for Hungary, but for European democracy, adding that he looked forward to working with Magyar on security and prosperity. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk described the result as a glorious victory, while welcoming what he called Hungary's renewed place alongside Poland and Europe. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky also congratulated Magyar, saying Ukraine was ready for closer cooperation and stronger regional stability. The Kremlin said it hoped to continue its highly pragmatic ties with Hungary's new political leadership after Prime Minister Viktor Orban, a close Russian partner, was beaten at the ballot box.
Венгры сделали свой выбор. Мы с уважением относимся к этому выбору.
The Hungarians have made their choice, and we respect that choice. We expect to continue our highly pragmatic contacts with Hungary's new leadership. We have heard statements about a readiness to engage in dialogue. Naturally, this would be beneficial both for Moscow and for Budapest.
Разумеется, это будет полезно и для Москвы, и для Будапешта.
In the United States, President Donald Trump did not immediately comment, while Democratic lawmaker Hakeem Jeffries criticized outgoing leader Viktor Orban in reaction to the result. Magyar said the vote showed Hungary's desire to rejoin Europe's political mainstream, as EU leaders signalled readiness to work with the new government and strengthen ties moving forward.
Joining us now to take a closer look at the change in Budapest is Veronika Angel, Assistant Professor of European Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. Veronika, welcome. Really good to have you on Primetime. Let's start with the big picture. How important of a moment is this for Hungary?
Well, domestically, the Hungarian people have experienced the election outcome as a moment of liberation. And politically, this is really a regime-level break with immediate consequences for Hungary, for Hungary's relation to the EU, to Ukraine, and to Russia. So what happened is that now a two-thirds supermajority will allow a full constitutional reset, and Prime Minister-elect Peter Magyar is already framing this moment as a full change of system. So he has enormous executive power, which he has promised to use to build strong democratic institutions, to eliminate Orban-era laws and the many loyalists that Orban had placed in the judiciary and in charge of state funds. And then the goal would be to give up that power and reform the constitution so the pendulum doesn't swing back if Orban or someone with his autocratic preferences were to win again. So actually, he also announced that he wants to limit the number of mandates that a prime minister can hold to 2, which makes Orban's return to that position impossible. But obviously, leaders who end up in such powerful positions like Magyar is right now rarely give up all the power. So we will have to see how committed Peter Magyar actually will be in practice.
You've put the supermajority in the parliament. When you look at that result and when you look at that high voter turnout, nearly 80%, what do you think really drove voters to go in this direction?
Well, there are many reasons. Hungary's economic deterioration and very visible corruption, I would say, became really impossible to ignore. And so was the moral collapse within Fidesz that had several scandals brought into the limelight. So Orban lost track of mounting discontent tied specifically to Hungary's economic situation, which was only worsened by his prolonged conflict with the European Union. The European Union being the main source of funding that is underpinning economic stability in Hungary. And as I said, at the same time, the level of corruption became too visible after 16 years of Orban's power. Famously, Viktor Orban's closest associate oligarch increased his personal fortune by 1.5 billion last year when Hungary's GDP grew by only half that. So truly visible corruption and absorption of EU funds in the hands of the few. And finally, I would say that Orban also misread how his foreign policy would land with the Hungarians. He has shown this very close alignment with Russia and tight links between Fidesz and Trump's MAGA movement that actually cut against a broader European shift towards more European Union, towards more an increasing anti-Trump sentiment across Europe, not just in Hungary. So Hungarians are not pro-Russian, and Orban really overestimated the durability of his very successful 2022 anti-war framing. Of course, you guys are showing images of Peter Magyar's victory, which is really important to notice that the outcome is also the merit of Peter Magyar and TISA, who kept discipline, who focused on corruption, the economy, and avoided culture wars and deprioritized Ukraine as a campaign issue.
Well, this is quite a shift, obviously, for Hungary itself, but also for the European Union. You've touched upon those frozen European funds for Hungary. How much will this change, in your mind, affect the dynamic between Brussels and Budapest?
Well, the scale of the shift is really already visible externally. The Cyprus presidency of the European Union is now already announced to move to unblock the 90 billion euro Ukraine loan and the 20th sanctions package on Russia that had been held up by Viktor Orban's government. Orban really had been able to stall EU decision-making on core strategic files to the benefit of Russia, and that constraint is now gone. So it is a moment of reset, but also the EU cannot simply release all the funds that it had held on rule of law and corruption concerns overnight, because we have to keep in mind that the procurement system remains structured so as to channel money into Fidesz-linked networks. So without reform first, some of which Peter Magyar has already announced, anti-corruption enforcement, judicial independence, media and academic freedom, EU money would just risk reproducing the same rants for the same people. But the rhetoric has already shifted, and the rest will follow, depending on Magyar's approach and how quickly he creates the space for EU-Hungary reset.
As you pointed out, there are already steps to revive those measures regarding Ukraine, be it the sanctions package on Russia or the loan. But how different do you expect the new Hungarian government's relation towards Kiev to be?
Oh, it will be different. Magyar has already stated that Ukraine is the victim of Russian aggression, which is already a change in vision, and he rejects the previous government's rhetoric. The shift is more towards alignment with mainstream European positions, so support for Ukraine's sovereignty, no imposed peace terms on Russian terms, a willingness to rebuild relations with Kyiv, but at the same time, we have also heard Magyar saying that he will not go all the way into the different direction where they would support enlargement to Ukraine while it's still at war. And Hungary will still condition parts of this relationship on resolving minority rights that are still important for Hungarians. But clearly, Hungary is moving from veto player to a potential facilitator, though not an enthusiastic supporter for Ukraine or for EU enlargement. But they will unblock sanction and realign with partners such as Donald Tusk, who is a great supporter of Ukraine. And Peter Magyar already announced that his first visit will be in Poland. So that is also a realignment.
Yes, we also saw that Donald Tusk post saying that he might be even happier than Peter Magyar. Now, when we look ahead, we know the numbers, the supermajority in the parliament. Do you expect this government to implement everything? We've heard Magyar saying today that quite a long press conference. And how long will it take to shift this course?
Well, formally, everything sounds very easy when you have 2/3 of a majority and the constitution in your favor, but it will be substantively hard. This 2/3 majority that Peter Magyar won allows a constitutional overhaul. And he's already putting pressure on Fidesz-appointed officials to resign, announcing rapid institutional redesign, including taking Hungary into the European Public Prosecutor Office to fight corruption. This is really and tying EU money to EU oversight mechanisms or local mechanisms better. So it's substantively hard because the system he inherits is deeply embedded. So even if TISA turns out to be this unusual party and people who assume so much power and give it up, right? So even if they refrain from using this expansive powers created under Orban for themselves, it still faces really entrenched patronage networks across the economy and in the media. So public procurement, which would allow them to deliver on their economic promises, remains a key choke point. And it's really, the mandate is transformative, but the state apparatus is still configured to resist transformation.
Veronica, thank you kindly for coming on Primetime and sharing your insight.
Thanks for having me.
Now, after the break, we return to our top story as Washington steps up pressure on Tehran, with President Donald Trump ordering a naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. Let's get back to our top story. Washington is stepping up pressure on Tehran, with President Donald Trump ordering a naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz after negotiations in Pakistan broke down, fueling renewed fears of escalation along a key global shipping corridor. Joining me now to break this down for us is Tom Armbruster, a former U.S. ambassador. Ambassador, welcome. Great to have you on the program. Let me start here. Naval blockade. That's a big move. How serious of an escalation are we looking at?
It's certainly a real escalation in the dedication of resources by the United States. It requires a tremendous amount of personnel and planning and that sort of thing. But when you think of an escalation, you think of steps, one step, next step, the next step. And in this case, it's hard to see exactly where the Trump administration is going. I think what it's more indicative of is just the impatience that the administration has shown. They've kind of gone from one thing to the next very quickly, and this is the next thing. It's rather hard to predict what the next logical step will be, especially since the talks broke down. But we have a history of one naval blockade being quite successful, with President John Kennedy blockading Cuba when the Soviets were bringing in ballistic missiles. So maybe they're looking at that as a precedent that could work. But to me, it really signals an impatience on the part of the administration.
Well, these Pakistan talks reportedly ran for 21 hours. So you'd imagine the nuclear issue was front and center. In your opinion, what really broke down at the last minute?
Well, there's such a large gulf in trust, and there's a real history of grievances on both sides that goes back for decades. So I'm going to go back to the word patience. You know, negotiators are going to have to get to know each other. They're going to have to build some trust. The U.S. started out very high level with the vice president. Typically, you're going to have more junior level people working out details, just setting the groundwork. Going in right away with the vice president, I think, raises the stakes and puts the pressure on to reach an agreement. But neither side is really ready. The United States is pushing for an answer, and the Iranians have had decades really to prepare for this. They know that they've been opposite the United States on so many issues, and Israel for many decades. And so they've been prepared for some kind of reaction like this. And I think they're going to be patient. They're going to probably wait the United States out. And we'll see if the Trump administration has the patience to put in the time to get to know these negotiators, or if they're just going to try to use more overwhelming force to get what they want.
In the meantime, we're also hearing very strong language about Iran being under pressure. Would you say that that's reality or just a part of the negotiating playbook?
Donald Trump has always been a showman, so you have to take everything with a little bit of grain of salt. I hope it's just showmanship or bluster, but the rhetoric was really strong to talk about taking out an entire civilization. That certainly hints at nuclear weapons, which in today's world is simply unacceptable, because the indiscriminate nature of nuclear weapons means that you can't just target military targets. You're going to inevitably involve civilian casualties. So I don't think there's any place for that kind of rhetoric. You know, maybe they were hoping that with that bluff, with that bluster, they would get the Iranians to do something. They did come to the table, but I don't think that's responsible leadership to involve that kind of talk of removing a civilization. It's just not. There's not a call for that, and there's been quite a reaction. You know, the Pope has come out against this kind of rhetoric and against the war, and Donald Trump is pushing on that pillar of global stability. You know, pushing back against the Pope. So a lot of the norms are just not respected by this administration. They push in places you wouldn't expect them to push. So I think it's all very unpredictable, which makes it very difficult for negotiators, not knowing where the administration is going.
Turning back to this blockade itself, it's being described as rather limited, but in practical terms, can something like that stay contained?
Well, this has been a choke point where the Iranians have been able to apply pressure. So it's putting a lot of ships and personnel at risk. It's a pretty dangerous game to keep it limited. We first have to see if it can be effective at all. So it's pretty tricky. No, I don't think that it can be a limited operation that will just go on for weeks and weeks. I think it's going to change the dynamic and probably is going to lead to some escalation.
You've touched upon the international reactions. We've also heard from the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. UK appears to be backing down from any military involvement in this blockade. How much of a rift would you say that signals in these allied relations at such a critical moment?
It is a critical moment, and it ripples across the foreign policy landscape. You know, the Russia-Ukraine war was the first thing to start pushing on the pillar that is NATO. You know, NATO is a real pillar in global security, and the Trump administration has been pushing against our allies, saying they're not doing enough for Ukraine, or they're not paying enough, and also siding with Russia quite often on a lot of the key questions. So NATO is already under stress, and now to have this war, which really came up quite quickly without a lot of preparation for our allies or preparation for the American public, it's putting more stress on. So Starmer is backing off and saying he can't go down this road. So I think the United States is going to have to regroup. We need our allies. The allies were needed for the Strait of Hormuz, and they didn't come through. So I think this go-it-alone approach is also quite risky.
Ambassador, thank you very much for coming on Primetime and sharing your analysis.
Thank you.
Now, after a short break, we will be checking in with our correspondents around the world for the latest developments from their regions. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Primetime. Let's now check in with our correspondents around the world, and we start in Britain. The UK is distancing itself from a growing US push in the Gulf, drawing a clear line over military involvement, even as tensions rise. A decision that highlights widening differences among allies over how to respond to Iran. Our UK correspondent Zainab Farajzadeh has more.
UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has refused to join a US-led blockade of the Strait of Hormuz after Donald Trump suggested Britain could support the operation. While Trump said allies, including the UK, may help with minesweeping, Downing Street has made clear its priority is protecting freedom of navigation, not enforcing a blockade. Officials have also warned that direct involvement could risk further escalation in an already fragile region. Speaking on Monday, Starmer said the UK would not be drawn into the Iran war, whatever the pressure, and confirmed Britain was not supporting the proposed blockade. The move comes as the United States pushes ahead with plans to block ships entering and leaving Iranian ports, following failed talks with Tehran aimed at securing a longer-term peace deal. Speaking to Fox News, Trump said other countries could join the effort and claimed NATO had offered support to help secure the waterway. He also suggested Britain could contribute minesweepers, something UK officials have not ruled out entirely, but insist would fall short of direct enforcement. Instead, the UK will continue its existing role in the region, including operating minesweepers and countering drone threats without taking part in blocking Iranian ports. In a call with French President Emmanuel Macron, Starmer underlined the need for a broad international coalition to protect shipping crews while continuing to push for de-escalation. The UK was not involved in the recent US-Iran talks in Islamabad, but diplomatic efforts are continuing. Last week, Starmer visited Gulf allies in a bid to strengthen regional ties, while the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, is expected in Washington to push for reopening the vital shipping route. Zainab Farajzadeh, News, Manchester, United Kingdom.
Diplomatic efforts are continuing behind the scenes following failed US-Iran talks, with Turkey stepping up contacts across key regional players, signaling that despite the lack of a breakthrough, negotiations are far from over. Adam Morrow has more.
Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan held a series of phone calls on Sunday with both U.S. and Pakistani officials to discuss the outcome of Iran-U.S. talks held in Islamabad over the weekend. According to Turkish diplomatic sources, discussions focused on positions presented at the talks and possible next steps in the negotiation process. Fidan also spoke separately with his Pakistani counterpart, Ishaq Dar, to assess the outcome of the talks. Iranian and U.S. delegations wrapped up more than 21 hours of face-to-face negotiations in the Pakistani capital early Sunday, without reaching an agreement. The talks were part of a broader diplomatic initiative aimed at de-escalating tensions following weeks of conflict between Iran and a joint U.S.-Israeli military coalition. Held behind closed doors, the talks reportedly covered several issues, including Iran's nuclear program, uranium enrichment, regional security, and the reopening of the Hormuz Strait to commercial shipping. Pakistan has played a key mediating role, hosting the talks and coordinating with regional actors, including Turkey. The negotiations came after a sharp escalation that has left more than 3,000 people dead in strikes on Iran since late February, according to Iranian figures. Tehran responded with retaliatory attacks across Israel, Iraq, Jordan, and Arab Gulf countries hosting U.S. assets before a fragile 2-week ceasefire was announced last week. Despite the lack of a broader agreement, officials say diplomatic contacts remain ongoing. Turkey is actively engaged in the diplomatic push, maintaining dialogue with both Western and regional actors in hopes of sustaining momentum towards a negotiated solution. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
Regional diplomacy is quietly gaining momentum, with fresh contacts pointing to cautious optimism over Afghanistan-Pakistan ties, and Turkey once again positioning itself at the center of efforts to ease tensions. Tamim Bahis has more on that in Kabul.
According to a statement from Afghanistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Turkish envoy in Kabul, Sadina Yildiz, met on Sunday with Foreign Minister Amirkhan Muttaqi, where both sides discussed regional developments and the negotiations recently held in Urumqi, China. The Afghan Foreign Minister says Muttaqi described relations between Afghanistan and Turkey as positive and appreciated what he called Turkey's earlier mediation efforts. On the talks with Pakistan, Muttaqi said so far the discussions have been positive, provided that minor technical issues do not hinder the progress of the negotiations. For his part, Turkish envoy Sadina Yildiz said positive relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan are of special importance to Turkey and stressed that Ankara will continue its efforts in this regard. While Kabul is presenting the latest talks context as constructive and signaling cautious optimism over the Urumqi process, there is still no fresh public response from Pakistan on this latest development. However, Islamabad has previously said military operations would continue as part of what it describes as its campaign against militant safe havens and cross-border threats. For now, the message coming from Kabul is that diplomatic engagement is continuing, with Turkey again positioning itself as a supportive regional actor, encouraging better ties between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, A News.
Tensions around the Strait of Hormuz are intensifying, with Iran signaling it could tighten control over the key waterway, raising fresh concerns over energy markets and the risk of further escalation with the United States. Tura Shiralelu picked up the story.
Iran's Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, issued a statement on social platform X, strongly warning the Americans of extraordinary high fuel prices after U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to blockade the Strait of Hormuz to Iranian vessels. Ghalibaf said, "Enjoy the current growth figures. With such a blockade, soon you will be longing for gasoline at a price of $4 to $5. Also, a senior Iranian MP said that a draft bill has been tabled at the parliament on the control of the Strait of Hormuz by Iran. According to Abbas Gudarzi, a spokesperson for the parliament's presiding board, the bill proposes prohibition of the passage of vessels of countries with which Iran is in conflict through the strait. While the deadlock in Iran-US talks continues, Tehran holds its grip on the strategic waterway as its bargaining chip in the ceasefire talks held following the Israeli-US war on Iran, which broke out in February and lasted for 39 days. Revolutionary Guards Navy said in a statement on Sunday that it will consider military vessels approaching the Strait of Hormuz as ceasefire violation, the Guards' Sepah News website reported, saying that the waterway is under the smart management of Iran. It added that the strait is open only for the safe passage of non-military vessels. Tura Shiralelu, Tehran, for A News.
Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan are launching a new effort to protect the Caspian Sea with international backing aimed at boosting regional cooperation on environmental risks. Sevil Rajapova has more from Tashkent.
The World Bank has approved financing for the Blue in the Caspian Sea project, designed to strengthen regional cooperation on environmental protection. The initiative involves Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, focusing on pollution management and biodiversity conservation. The Global Environment Facility will allocate $11.7 million in grant funding, with the World Bank and the United Nations Environment Programme acting as implementing agencies. The program also includes additional funding for preparatory work, environmental safeguards, and coordination among participating countries. Earlier, Kazakhstan allocated about $2.4 million from its reserves for the Kazakhstan Scientific Research Institute of the Caspian Sea, according to the government press service. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan has about $1.9 million allocated within a UN Habitat program for climate adaptation along the Caspian coast, including national planning and resilience projects, according to a UN Habitat project proposal submitted to the Adaptation Fund. The initiative is expected to improve environmental monitoring, strengthen pollution control systems, and support biodiversity conservation across the Caspian Sea basin. Participating countries will also work on developing joint approaches to managing marine resources and reducing environmental risks. The program aims to help the region meet commitments under the Tehran Convention and enhance long-term cooperation on protecting the Caspian Sea ecosystem. It is Sevil Rajapova reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan A News.
Asian economies are moving to secure alternative energy supplies, with South Korea edging closer to a deal with Kazakhstan, part of a wider shift away from Middle Eastern oil amid growing instability in the region. Fariza Kalimurzina has more from Almaty.
South Korea is close to finalizing a deal to import crude oil from Kazakhstan, according to Reuters, as Asian countries step up efforts to secure alternative energy supplies amid instability in the Middle East. Industry Minister Kim Jong-un said on Sunday that negotiations have made significant progress, with specific volumes and details expected to be announced early next week. He added that Kazakhstan is becoming part of Seoul's broader strategy to reduce dependence on Middle Eastern oil. Earlier this month, South Korea's Chief of Staff Kang Hoon-sik and Industry Minister Kim visited Kazakhstan to discuss potential shipments of crude oil and naphtha, as concerns persist over disruptions linked to the Strait of Hormuz. Kim also noted that distance is not a major barrier, saying deliveries from Kazakhstan take around 50 to 60 days, similar to shipments from the United States. South Korea remains heavily dependent on imported energy, with around 70% of its crude oil coming from the Middle East. But the rising geopolitical risks are pushing Seoul to widen its supplier base, including commitments from other producers such as the United Arab Emirates, which agreed last month to supply 24 million barrels of oil. Japan is also moving in the same direction. With more than 90% of its oil imports coming from the Middle East, Tokyo is looking to diversify supply routes. Japanese energy company INPEX is considering redirecting part of its supplies from Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan to the domestic market, as previously reported. But rerouting shipments away from the Strait of Hormuz can take up to 55 days instead of about 20, increasing costs and adding pressure on global energy markets. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
Spain is deepening its engagement with China, with Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez signaling a push for closer economic ties, even as other Western countries take a more cautious approach to Beijing. For more on that, we go to Mahnur Makhdoom in Beijing.
Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez is on a 5-day visit to China, his 4th trip to the country in just 4 years, highlighting Spain's push to strengthen economic and strategic relations with the world's second-largest economy. During the visit, Sanchez is expected to hold talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping, Premier Li Qiang, and other senior officials, with discussions focused on boosting trade, investment, and cooperation in sectors such as green energy, technology, and the digital economy. The repeated visits reflect a deliberate strategy by Madrid to maintain strong engagement with Beijing, even as other Western nations adopt a more cautious approach towards China. Spain has positioned China as a key economic partner, with bilateral trade exceeding $50 billion and a growing interest in Chinese investment across industrial and energy sectors. Sanchez has also used the trip to call for a greater Chinese role in global governance, urging Beijing to contribute more on issues including climate change, security, and global inequality, while emphasizing the need for a more balanced and cooperative international order. Sanchez's 4th visit in as many years highlights the continued high-level exchanges between China and Spain and shows Madrid's intent to pursue an independent foreign policy that balances transatlantic ties with deeper engagement in Asia. Manu Maktoum, A-News, Beijing.
After a short break, we'll be taking a look at other news making the headlines today. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said fighting in Lebanon will continue, speaking during a visit near the border on Sunday. He described ongoing operations in the south as part of military efforts against Hezbollah, adding Israeli forces will maintain a presence inside what he called a security zone.
The war continues, including within the security zone in Lebanon, where I was just a short while ago. What we are seeing is that we have thwarted the threat of an invasion from Lebanon thanks to this security zone. We are pushing back the danger of anti-tank fire and also dealing with indirect fire. But there is still more work to be done. We have done tremendous work, achieved enormous accomplishments, but there is still more to do, and we are doing it.
Pope Leo XIV has begun an extensive tour of Africa, using his first stop to spotlight the continent's growing importance to the Catholic Church, while also delivering a message of peace amid rising global tensions.
Pope Leo landed in Algiers on Monday, where he was received by Algerian President Abdelmadjid Tebboune at the airport before holding further talks at the presidential palace. The visit marks the first stop of a 10-day tour across 4 African countries, aimed at drawing global attention to the continent, where more than a fifth of the world's Catholics live. The trip is one of the most complex papal tours in recent years, covering nearly 18,000 kilometers and 11 cities across Algeria, Cameroon, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea. Despite Algeria being an overwhelmingly Muslim country, the visit is seen as symbolically significant for the Catholic Church and its growing presence in Africa. The Pope's arrival also comes after a public attack from US President Donald Trump, who criticized him over his stance on global conflicts. Speaking aboard his flight, Pope Leo dismissed the criticism and said he would continue to speak out against war. During his stay in Algiers, the Pope also visited a major national monument, where he delivered a message focused on peace and justice.
The future belongs to men and women of peace. In the end, justice will always triumph over injustice, just as violence, despite all appearances, will never have the last word.
This is the third journey of Pope Leo outside Italy since the beginning of his pontificate. He is expected to continue his tour in Cameroon next, followed by visits to Angola and Equatorial Guinea later this week.
Well, US President Donald Trump has criticized Pope Leo, accusing him of being weak on crime and poor on foreign policy, after the pontiff condemned what he described as a dangerous mindset driving the US-Israel war with Iran.
I don't
don't think he's doing a very good job. He likes crime, I guess. He hit us. Think of it. He's worried about fear. What about the fear when the ministers and the priests and all of those great people that were arrested during COVID, and in many cases they're outside 10 feet apart and they were arrested. We don't like a pope that's going to say that it's okay to have a nuclear weapon. We don't want a pope that says crime is okay in our cities. I don't like it. I'm not a big fan of Pope Leo. He's a very liberal person, and he's a man that doesn't believe in stopping crime.
Algeria has formally declared French colonization a crime in a new law approved by Parliament, a move that sharpens its historical stance while keeping the door open to dialogue with Paris.
Algeria's upper house, the Council of the Nation, has approved a new law declaring French colonization a crime. The move comes weeks after the lower house passed the same bill. The law refers to France's rule over Algeria from 1830 to 1962. Officials say it aims to protect national memory and honour those who suffered during that period. Earlier drafts called for an official apology and possible reparations from France, but Algerian President Abdelmajid Tebboune clarified that Algeria is seeking recognition of past crimes, not financial compensation. The final version removes broad demands for reparations. However, it keeps provisions for victims of French nuclear tests in the Sahara. Tensions between Algeria and France remain high. Disputes over migration, history, and France's support for Morocco on Western Sahara continue to strain ties. President Tebboune says direct talks with his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, are key to resolving the dispute. In 2021, Macron acknowledged that the colonization of Algeria was a crime against humanity, but stopped short of offering a formal state apology.
A landmark ruling in France has found a major multinational company guilty of financing terrorism, a decision that could have far-reaching consequences for how businesses operate in conflict zones.
Former executives of cement giant Lafarge, now part of Switzerland's Holcim, have heard the verdict in their long-running trial. A Paris court found Lafarge guilty of financing terrorism between 2013 and 2014 to keep a plant operating in Syria during the conflict, and also guilty of breaching European sanctions. 8 former employees, including senior executives, were also convicted. The trial centered on claims that Lafarge, through its Syrian operations, made payments to armed groups, including Islamic State and the Nusra Front, both listed as terrorist organizations by the EU. The presiding judge said the payments helped to undermine stability by funding deadly attacks in Syria. And beyond, the court also found that more than 800,000 euros were paid to secure safe passage for staff to reach the plant. In a separate US case, Lafarge admitted in 2022 that its Syrian subsidiary paid around $6 million to ISIS and the Nusra Front to keep operations running and allow movement through checkpoints, later agreeing to pay hundreds of millions in fines and forfeitures. There was no immediate reaction from Lafarge or Holcim, and the court has yet to announce the company's sentence. The case marks the first time a company has been tried and convicted in France for financing terrorism, and is among the most closely watched cases linked to the Syrian conflict.
Australia has appointed Lieutenant General Susan Coyle as the first woman to lead its army, marking a historic change in the country's military leadership. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced that Coyle, currently Chief of Joint Capabilities, will take over as Chief of Army in July. Coyle, who joined the military in 1987, becomes the first woman to command any branch of Australia's defence forces in its 125-year history. The reshuffle also includes top defence leadership changes as Australia continues to modernise its military and boost female representation in the armed forces.
Her achievement means that she will be the first woman to command a service in Australian history, and it is a deeply historic moment, one that should be noted. As Susan said to me, you cannot be what you cannot see. And Susan's achievement will be deeply significant to women who are serving in the Australian Defence Force today and women who are thinking about serving in the Australian Defence Force in the future.
Benin's presidential election is shaping up as a choice between progress and security, with voters weighing visible economic gains against rising concerns over instability in the country's north.
As Benin heads into a presidential election, voters are weighing a decade of visible economic change against growing security concerns. At an industrial site near Cotonou, young workers are cutting and stitching fabric inside newly built production units. The factory reflects Benin's push to process more of its own cotton at home, create jobs, and keep more value inside the country.
Creating value, generating wealth, and ensuring that wealth is shared among those who produce it, from cotton farmers to the processing of the raw material and the manufacture of t-shirts, military uniforms, and leggings at this facility. The idea is simple. We have the raw material, so why not process it ourselves before shipping it out? We remain firmly committed to this approach within our group.
For the ruling camp, projects like this are part of a broader case to voters that industrial growth, infrastructure spending, and modernised public services are delivering visible results.
Not everyone is lucky enough to have a job these days, but I am one of the lucky ones. I leave every morning and return in the evening, and I am happy with my job.
But analysts say the election is also a test of whether those gains can outweigh worsening insecurity in northern Benin and wider concerns about national stability.
It is very important to contain the deteriorating security situation in northern Benin, as it could have a national impact. In many cases across West Africa and beyond, worsening insecurity has affected the mindset of the armed and security forces and, at times, contributed to coups. So there is a link between security deterioration and political stability at the national level. Benin must be very careful about this risk. The failed coup attempt last December does not mean the danger has been eliminated.
The vote is now seen as a measure of whether economic momentum and visible development remain more persuasive to voters than security fears and governance concerns.
Made in Benin labels are gaining ground globally thanks to investment in textile manufacturing. At a new industrial hub, Benin is turning its cotton into finished garments and boosting employment. Here's that report.
Benin, Africa's largest cotton producer, is moving up the value chain by turning raw fibre into finished textiles at a new industrial hub. At the Glo Jigbe industrial zone, the country is pushing to industrialise its economy and reduce reliance on raw exports.
Most African countries, for the longest time, Benin have always exported its raw agricultural commodities and its mining resources. But starting in 2016, we had a new president, President Talon, who wanted to change Benin economy. And for that, he wanted to industrialize the country.
Benin produces more than 750,000 tonnes of cotton each year. In the past, much of it was exported to countries like India and Bangladesh for processing. Now, the new industrial zone is helping to keep more of that value at home. The project is expected to create tens of thousands of jobs, with more than 600 already in place.
I used to work, but it wasn't profitable. However, thanks to Navaria Textile at GDIZ, I had the opportunity to come here to work and learn about the necessary machinery, as well as to improve my skills in certain areas.
Benin has already begun exporting finished garments to international markets, positioning its Made in Benin label as both competitive and more sustainable, using locally sourced cotton and cleaner energy.
Turkey has begun its first overseas deep-sea oil exploration, with the Çağrı Bey vessel arriving off Mogadishu. The project, carried out in partnership with Somalia, will drill to a depth of 7,500 meters placing it among the world's deepest offshore operations.
Turkey's deep-sea drilling vessel Chagri Bey arrived off the coast of Mogadishu to launch the country's first overseas deep-sea oil exploration project. The project follows seismic surveys conducted by the Oruj race vessel, which collected data over 234 days across 3 offshore blocks. The surveys helped determine the drilling location. Turkish Energy Minister Alparslan Bayraktar said the project marked a new era in Turkish petroleum exploration. The planned well will reach a depth of 7,500 meters.
The area where it will operate is offshore, about 370 kilometers from here, with a water depth of approximately 3,500 meters. From the seabed, we are planning a drilling depth of 4,000 meters, reaching a total depth of 7,500 meters. In this respect, it will be the second deepest offshore drilling operation in the world.
Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud underlined that the country's natural resources are a shared national asset and stressed the importance of ensuring their benefits reach all citizens.
Profits from the resources will benefit all Somalis, wherever they live in the country. There is no concept that a well drilled in one region belongs only to the people of that region. Natural resources are national wealth and will benefit all Somalis, equally or through different mechanisms.
Turkey is one of Somalia's main military and economic partners, with Ankara inaugurating its largest overseas base in Mogadishu in 2017. The drilling campaign is expected to last nearly 10 months, with weather conditions in the region likely to remain a key factor.
And finally, Azerbaijan reopened its embassy in Tehran on Sunday, the country's foreign ministry said. The mission will initially operate with a limited number of diplomatic and administrative staff, including the ambassador. Baku said the swift reopening underscores the special importance Azerbaijan attaches to its relations with neighboring Iran. Baku withdrew its diplomatic personnel from Tehran and from the country's consulate in Tabriz on March 6th, a day after a drone attack launched from Iranian territory toward Azerbaijan's Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic. And that brings us to the end of Primetime. Join us again tomorrow for more insight, analysis, and perspective from here in Baku and around the world. From all of us here at A News, thank you for watching and have a nice evening.